During his tenure as Deputy Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, Jameel Jaffer spent years trying to lift the veil of secrecy surrounding America's drone program. Now founding director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, he details what's been unearthed so far in his new book. It's called The Drone Memos, Targeted Killings, Secrecy, and the Law. Jameel Jaffer joins us now to consider what the drone program became under President Obama and what it might be like under President Trump. You still getting used to saying those two words?
I am. Yes. Yeah, we'll see if I get used to it. We'll see if I get used to it.
I'm inferring, just from the way the book looks on the cover, that you've lifted the veil of secrecy a bit, but still not entirely.
I think that's right. There's certainly more transparency about the program now than was true 4 years ago or 6 years ago. But there's still a lot that we don't know.
We've had you on this program a few times talking about this, and how much do we actually know about the process from the time someone is targeted for execution to the actual pushing of the button?
Well, we certainly know more about that than we did. There is a document that we got just a few months ago called the Presidential Policy Guidance, which President Obama put in place in May of 2013. But it wasn't released until just a few months ago. And that document spells out how these decisions are made, how individuals are placed on the so-called kill list, who decides whether a particular individual...
I got that here. You want to put this up? We may as well put this up right now since we're here already, because here we go. This is the Presidential Policy Guidance that Jameel just referred to, and let's put this graphic up. Number one, an individual poses a continuing and imminent threat to U.S. persons. Number two, there is a near certainty that the terrorist target is present and civilians will not be injured or killed. Number three, capture is not feasible. Number four, the country where the strike would take place is unwilling or unable to address the threat. Or number five, no reasonable alternative is available to address the threat. In your view, does this adequately constrain executive power?
Well, so there are a couple things. The short answer is no, but there are a couple of things you need to know about that document. One is that document applies only outside places of actual hostilities. And this phrase, areas of active hostilities, is not a term of art under international law. It's something that the Obama administration essentially made up to divide the world between places that looked like conventional battlefields and everywhere else. And there's some ambiguity about how the decision is made to characterize a specific place as a conventional battlefild or, on the other hand, a place removed from actual hostilities. So that's the first thing you have to know. The second thing you have to know is that while many of those terms that you just read seem restrictive on their face, the people who wrote those definitions are the same people who decide whether the definitions are satisfied in any particular instance. And so even to the extent those terms are or seem restrictive, there's this question of their application in individual instances.
So you can drive the proverbial Mack truck through some of these loopholes.
You can. Now, I said there are two things to know. There's a third thing to know, which is that those phrases which do seem restrictive when you first read them, they actually have some important wiggle room in them. That phrase, the first phrase you read, continuing an imminent threat. Under international law, the key question, or one of the key questions, is whether somebody presents an imminent threat. The administration has stretched that concept to this new concept of continuing an imminent threats. And by stretching that concept, they have widened the aperture significantly in terms of who can be targeted and who can't be.
Well, I note the thing is also called the Presidential Policy Guidance.
That's right.
It's not called Presidential Policy, you must do this.
That's right. That's right.
That's a distinction worth noting, I guess.
That is. So these are terms, and this is what I was sort of alluding to when I said that the same people who wrote the definitions apply them. There's no way to enforce these rules in any court. They're not legally enforceable as far as the administration is concerned. In its view, this is a policy overlay on top of international law.
Let's just take a step back here and remind people of some of the background here. The decision to target and execute somebody whom the administration believes is a terrorist or a potential threat to the United States of America, is that ultimately the president's decision?
Yes.
Can anybody else
ultimately.
make that call?
Well, in practice, some of the president's advisors make that call. When there's disagreement among cabinet officials, the disagreement will go to the president for resolution. In many cases, though, there's no disagreement. And so while those people report to the president doesn't actually review the file.
So, in effect, the Secretary of Defense or the National Security
right.
Advisor can make that decision, and
That's
it doesn't
right.
have to go to the president.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Which has to be the case given the scale of the program, because now you're talking about hundreds of people being targeted, and if the president actually did review those files, the president would be able to do nothing else. So once you have a program on the scale, I think it's inevitable. The decision making is going to flow down, and accountability is going to become more dispersed.
Does the president always know when the decision has been made and the target has been taken?
I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect that the answer is no, just given the number of strikes that take place.
My recollection when we've talked about this in the past was there will be a slice of progressive America, which is licking its wounds today, of course, who will think, you know what, Barack Obama is a sane and reasonable man, and as long as these powers are held by him, there's nothing to worry about, and after all, there never would be a madman in the White House anyway who we would distrust with having these powers.
Right.
Except that those same people now believe that there is a madman about to take over the White House who will have these powers. What are the implications of that?
Well, this is one of the really frustrating things, is that throughout the Obama administration, civil libertarians and human rights advocates were saying precisely what everybody else is saying now, which is that you shouldn't invest powers in the presidency because you trust the president. The powers are going to outlast any particular president. And yet, that's exactly what happened. For 8 years, Americans invested more and more power in the presidency. They allowed President Obama to create powers that President Bush would never have been able to create, given the distrust that most Americans felt towards his administration in 2008 when he left office. But President Obama came in with a lot of trust. People thought of him as he was, in fact, a constitutional lawyer. He was somebody who was sensitive to human rights concerns, not just on national security issues, but more broadly. And because they trusted him, they were willing to allow him to exercise these unreviewed powers. And now those powers are going to be handed over to somebody who sees the world very differently.
And what do you think about that?
Look, I didn't like these powers when they were in the hands of President Obama. President Trump has already promised to use powers like this much more aggressively, so I feel even unhappier about it now.
Can I just follow up on that? What has President-elect Trump said specifically that would lead you to believe that he's going to ramp this thing up even more than President Obama did?
Yeah, well, so specifically it's hard because President-elect Trump has not actually spelled out with any specificity how he intends to use these powers or any other powers. But he has said that he's unhappy with the Obama administration's policies with respect to ISIS, and unhappy from a kind of hawkish perspective, feeling that those policies are not aggressive enough. So I assume that he's going to push the envelope on that set of policies. And we already have an administration, with the Obama administration, that has accepted, however reluctantly, the idea that the battlefield is borderless. We already have an administration that is carrying out drone strikes in half a dozen countries without, again, judicial review or even meaningful congressional review. And the idea that those policies are now going to be turned up a notch or many notches, I think is something that should scare people.
It seems a reasonable inference to draw, though, considering President-elect Trump has said he favors torture, he thinks it works, and therefore we can assume there will be more to come.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Yeah. I do want to follow up again on one thing you just said, and that is Anwar al-Awlaki, who, to my knowledge, is he the only American who's been targeted and killed under this program?
He's the only one who was targeted. There's 7 Americans now who have been killed. Yeah.
And you mentioned no court oversight in any of this program as well.
Right.
What role did you have in the court cases against the U.S. government officials surrounding Unlucky's death.
Well, an unsuccessful role. But I went to court with some of my colleagues at the ACLU.
When you were then there, you're not there
Right,
anymore.
right. I was at the ACLU until just a couple of months ago, and I worked with some of my colleagues in 2010 to bring a suit against the U.S. government on behalf of Anwar al-Awlaki's family, who were challenging the lawfulness of the kill list. Everybody accepted that the government had the authority to use lethal force against people who truly presented an imminent threat to the country. But there was a question of whether the government should have to present evidence to a judge to justify the strike, either before the strike or after the strike. And so we filed a lawsuit before the strike that killed Anwar al-Awlaki, and another lawsuit after the strike that killed him, another U.S. citizen, and Anwar's 16-year-old son.
Yes.
And both of those cases were dismissed. The first one was dismissed on the theory that the father didn't have standing didn't have the right to assert the rights of his son, Anwar. And the second one was dismissed on the grounds that the question of whether any particular person is a legitimate target for lethal force is a question committed to the political branches, to Congress and to the president.
And not you.
And, well, certainly not me, but not even to the judiciary.
In fact, I think this was, again, before al-Awlaki was killed. The judge wrote in his decision, the executive's unilateral decision to kill a U.S. citizen overseas was constitutionally committed to the political branches and judicially unreviewable.
That's right. That's right. And the second decision, which is a second ruling, which was 6 months later or a year later after the strike that killed the 3 Americans, was written by a different judge, but said essentially the same thing, that this decision to target an American citizen with lethal force on the grounds that he's an enemy of the state. And even this decision that resulted in the deaths of 2 other Americans who weren't targeted, that decision is unreviewable by the courts.
And that is still the case.
Still the case.
Do you think there's any possibility of changing that?
You know, in 2013, at the beginning of 2013, there was, it's hard to believe it now, but there was a serious debate about the necessity of legislation to create either some kind of new court, a drone court, to review the evidence in relation to strikes like this, or legislation to reaffirm the role of the ordinary federal courts in reviewing the lawfulness of these kinds of strikes. But that debate ended up going nowhere. The administration didn't support it. Congress didn't end up proposing any legislation. And the debate just sort of petered out. Now, I think it seems my first instinct is that it's even less likely to happen now, given the way that the government is changing. But it is a little bit hard to predict, because some of the people who felt most strongly that there ought to be some check outside the executive branch were actually on the right. They were libertarians, and they felt very strongly that it was a mistake to invest powers this sweeping in the hands of the executive branch alone. So I suppose it's possible that with the rejiggering of government, that we will see renewed interest in imposing those kinds of checks. But I wouldn't put money on it.
You've got a president right now who seems to want to accrue unto himself, or you will have a president, I should say, who seems to want to accrue a great deal of power unto himself, and you have his party in place in the House and in the Senate. And he seems to be on a roll right now, so it seems unlikely that they're going to want to challenge.
Certainly in the short term, I think that's right. I think that's right.
Where does that leave the country, do you think?
You know, I think that the press is going to have to play a big role over the next couple of years, with the presidency, the House, and the Senate in the hands of one party,
and pretty soon the Supreme Court as well. Once Trump appoints who he wants.
That's right. That's right. The Supreme Court will move to the right. I think that the press is going to have to play a very important role in holding government officials accountable for their decisions.
The only trouble with that is we've already seen that at least half of America, and who knows, maybe more, don't care about what the press reports, think the press lies, has certainly been inspired by the new president-elect to believe that the media has a nefarious role to play in American civil life.
No, I think that's right. I think it's a very worrying thing. But the only checks I see right now that can even conceivably operate are the media and civil society, and I'm sure that organizations like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch will continue to be vigilant in monitoring and challenging the abuses of the next presidency. But I think that the press is going to have to step up as well.
So just to be clear, on the 20th of January, 2017, immediately after he takes the oath of office and becomes the 45th president, Donald Trump, from that moment on, can order a drone strike against anybody he believes to be a clear and imminent and present danger to America.
You know what? I wish that were the rule. That would be a better rule than the one we have. He can order a drone strike against anyone he believes to be a continuing and imminent threat, and that's a standard he can determine. He can determine himself whether that standard has been satisfied. And if anyone challenges, if anyone argues that standard hasn't been satisfied, he will have decisions that were issued during the Obama administration to rely on when he goes to court. He'll be able to say, the courts have already held that decisions like this are off limits.
Is there any precedent which would help us understand whether or not the target can or cannot be on American soil?
That's a good question. The Bush administration, during the Bush administration, there was, as you'll remember, this debate about the detention of people seized on American soil and the detention of them as enemy combatants without access to the courts, without access to counsel, and that was a very, very controversial thing. I think it's possible that if the U.S. government began carrying out drone strikes, or it doesn't have to be with a drone, it could be with a gun, right? On American soil, there would be a different reaction to those kinds of actions than there has been to drone strikes carried out abroad. I'm not sure, how much comfort I take from that distinction.
There is something, though, about out of sight, out of mind. This thing happens halfway around the world. The public gets less exercise.
That's true. That's true. And this is one of the things with drones more generally, is that they sort of only increase the distance between us and the violence that's being carried out in our names. It's possible to carry out this kind of distance now with somebody sitting at an Air Force base in Nevada, and they're carrying out the strikes in Pakistan or in Yemen. And that kind of distance makes it, easy to forget that the violence is taking place at all.
I know you won't like this kind of blunt a question, and by blunt I don't mean direct. I mean it's a bit of a blunt instrument that I'm asking you to consider here. But ever since 9/11, Americans have been, in many cases justifiably, obsessed with their personal security. We understand why. Has this program helped keep America safer?
Right. I don't mind that question at all. I mean, I think that's that's an important question. But I want to first address your premise. I think that obviously terrorism is a real threat, and I live in New York. I know it's a real threat, but it is important to keep some perspective on the scale of the threat. And there are many other things out there that present a greater threat to the United States and to the world than terrorism.
Mathematically and statistically speaking, you're right. But they don't necessarily capture the public's imagination or fear the way terrorism
does. That's my complaint. Yeah. That's my complaint. But and then to address your the second piece of it, which is does it actually work? Does this program actually work? This is not my expertise, right? I'm not somebody who can I don't study the effectiveness of these kinds of programs. But when I wrote the book, I studied what other people had written about the effectiveness of the program, and you can find no shortage of national security and military experts who say that at most this is working tactically but not strategically, meaning that if you're thinking only about tomorrow, then yes, you can make the argument that it works. But you can't find anyone out there. It's very hard to find people out there who say that this is working as a strategy. The net effect. If you look at Al Qaeda, for example, ACAP, Al Qaeda, in Yemen, right? The number of people who are associated with that organization now is far greater than the number that were associated with it when the drone program launched 5 years ago, 6 years
This is
ago.
inspiring more people to join.
Right, you kill one person and everybody in their family is now replacing them, right? And over time, these groups have become not just bigger, but also more sophisticated and in some ways more ruthless, right? So, even Dennis Blair, who was the President Obama's counterterrorism advisor at the beginning of his administration, has said that this is not a program that's working.
I want to thank you very much for coming into TVO tonight, sharing some
Thanks
time
for
with us.
inviting me.
All about the drone memos, targeted killing, secrecy, and the law. Jameel Jaffer, great to have you up here at TVO again.
Thanks
so
again.
much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.